Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha. You're watching Perspective, where today we're going to discuss the crisis in our neighbor, Pakistan. The Supreme Court of the country has adjourned hearing by a day, that is till Tuesday, the high-profile case about the rejection of a no-confidence motion against Prime Minister Imran Khan and the subsequent dissolution of Parliament. A larger bench of the Supreme Court took action after Deputy Speaker Qasim Suri rejected the move to dislodge the Prime Minister by declaring the no-trust motion unmaintainable due to its link with the so-called foreign conspiracy. Also, President Alvi, the Supreme Court Bar Association, and all political parties have been made respondents in this case. On Monday, lawyers from the government as well as the opposition presented their arguments regarding the ruling by the Deputy Speaker. All representatives will be heard before any ruling in the matter, according to the Chief Justice of Pakistan, who has now adjourned the case until 12 p.m. on Tuesday. So until the hearing concludes and a ruling is given by the Supreme Court, multiple questions remain on what will be the future of the political discourse in our neighboring country. Will Pakistan's Supreme Court weigh in on whether the Deputy Speaker violated the Constitution when he dismissed the no-trust vote? What will be the future of Imran Khan, who has already begun preparing for elections? Also, what hope do the opposition parties have now? And most importantly, is Pakistan ready for a fresh round of elections, given its economic health at the moment? We'll try and find answers to some of these questions and more on the show today with an eminent panel of experts who are joining me on the program. So let me first introduce them to you. I have with me three distinguished panelists joining me virtually. Mr. T.C. Raghavan, former High Commissioner of India to Pakistan, Lieutenant General retired Syed Atta Hasnain, he's a defense expert, and also Professor Swarn Singh, he's chairperson, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on Sansad TV for this edition of Perspective. Ambassador, allow me to begin the program today with you. In fact, what is your assessment of the situation in our neighboring country, looking at the manner in which events have unfolded in the last 2 days?
Well, in Pakistan today, in very brief, you have a combination of a political crisis, which was relatively straightforward because it appeared that the ruling coalition had lost the numbers game. But that political crisis is now part of a larger constitutional crisis, because rather than face a motion of no confidence, the government, or rather the speaker acting on behalf of the government, dismissed the motion of no confidence. And simultaneously, the president of Pakistan has announced fresh elections. Now, whether both these steps are provided for within the framework of Pakistan's constitution is questionable, and that is something which their Supreme Court will pronounce on. But this is a mixture of now a political and a constitutional crisis, and it will require some amount of untangling. For instance, can the status quo be restored? That means you go back 2 or 3 days and hold a motion of no confidence, and depending on that, Prime Minister Imran Khan makes his way out and a new Prime Minister is elected? Or is that option no longer feasible and the Supreme Court has to think laterally about what are the next steps? So this is a combination of politics and constitutional issues. So we will have to see how this logjam can be resolved. At the moment, there are any number of guesses and any number of bets floating around.
Absolutely. Until the Supreme Court gives out a ruling and which gives clarity on how the situation is unfolding in Pakistan. Professor, how do you look at the situation, especially in the manner in which Imran Khan was able to dodge the no-confidence vote against him? Do you think it was a clever ploy on his part that could pay off in the longer run for him, for his future? He's already begun preparing for elections. He's called a parliamentary board meeting on Tuesday.
Thank you, Tina, for having me on your show. I think the political and constitutional crisis, the way they are unfolding, I can to some extent understand Imran Khan underwriting the narrative, but it has to be in consonance with the General Bajwa and the military in general, because that is where the real power lies. What is very clearly definite, even if in a very remote case, you could have a situation of National Assembly being revived, that Imran Khan definitely has to go, and it establishes a very unpleasant reality of Pakistan having never seen a prime minister completing a full term. And that history continues to be maintained, whatever comes out of these crises.
Yes.
Second, for the first time, there was a possibility of democracy sort of strengthening itself and removing a prime minister in the due process, which is the democratic process, which again has been lost. Obviously, it's not likely to happen that a formal no confidence motion will be passed, and that is how one prime minister will be replaced by another. So some of these limitations of what is often called a Praetorian democracy, which is where military is in control of the system, that showcases that there is, more it changes, the less it sort of changes in that sense. Not much is changing on the ground in Pakistan, except, of course, it is also true that if you have to look at a leader who's perhaps least kind of demolished by the history of Pakistan, so far it will be, of course, Prime Minister Imran Khan. And in that sense, he's trying to find for himself some kind of a niche to come back. Pakistan has seen prime ministers coming back again many times. So he's looking at a possibility of him becoming, not just being seen as a stooge and a puppet of military, but, in that case, going out fighting and then finding a narrative for himself in case he has to go and contest elections again, which could open possibilities of, Imran Khan coming back again. Though we understand that over a period of time, there have been instances where he's kind of stood at variance, if not confronted military's decision and army chief's decision. And there have been instances wherever prime ministers have crossed red lines, Bhutto or Nawaz Sharif or now Imran Khan, in terms of undermining the authority of or centrality of armed forces. They have been kicked out of office very often. In Bhutto's case, he was sent to gallows. I mean, you remember the equation between General Ziaul Haq and Bhutto in that sense. So in that sense, Pakistan is more or less repeating some of that history, in which case I think we might see this kind of uncertainty staying on for some more longer period of time. Now, what kind of caretaker prime minister comes in place now, that is something which is again most interesting, because that will tell us what is unfolding immediately in these constitutional and political crises, how much impactful that kind of caretaker government will be, because the greatest crisis for Pakistan today is economic crisis. The rupee is kind of falling.
And I'll come back to you to understand further on how things look in the run-up to the elections. The parties, in fact, Imran Khan's party has already begun preparing, as I mentioned earlier as well. But, Lieutenant General, the crux of the matter is the jinx of the Prime Minister's position continues in Pakistan, no Prime Minister having completed a full 5-year term. That we are witnessing with Imran Khan as well. Although he's been able to dodge it, he was talking about a trump card, which we saw how he used yesterday. Now, all of this has led to a mix of political crisis, constitutional crisis, and overriding all of these is, of course, the economic crisis of which the professor also spoke about. Does all of this lay a fertile ground for the army to weigh in? All this while, the army has tried to maintain a neutral stand. But looking at the state of affairs now, what's happening in Pakistan, do you think it's the perfect situation for the army?
And I agree entirely with both my fellow panelists. I think the points made by them are very well taken. But my issue, which I'm looking at, is something a little different. Yes, if the situation goes through with the Supreme Court tomorrow, 12 o'clock, giving its directions to turn the clock back 3 days and go over the whole procedure in the National Assembly, things could pan out quite comfortably for Pakistan. But I fear, and that may be a remote chance, I fear with the economic crisis going on, the constitutional crisis in accompaniment and the political crisis all put together in the melting pot, there is every chance of street violence. There is every chance of this entire thing turning into something much more turbulent. This is something Pakistan should hope that it does not happen, because the opposition is up in arms. They've been robbed of this chance of defeating Imran Khan, showing him in lower light, etc., which they would have loved to do. And if they are robbed of this chance once again by the Supreme Court, it could very well turn down to the streets. Now, that is the extreme contingency which I'm looking at, in which case the Pakistan army, which appears to be very reluctant at the moment, it appears very reluctant to step in at the moment, primarily because it does not want to be saddled with this kind of situation. The terrible economy that they will, which is becoming the legacy of Imran Khan, the kind of radical elements all over internal security, not very stable, and the foreign policy itself in a bit of a shambles. Relations with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with the United States to some extent. So it's not a happy situation for the army to step in immediately. Although one doesn't really see that if this kind of turbulence on the streets suddenly erupts, then there is really no option but for General Bajwa to step in. Last point on this. I do think for the first time we are seeing some cracks in the Pakistan army too. Just remember that this whole situation was triggered in the month of December or so by Faiz Hamid, the ex-DG ISI, his removal from the appointment of DG ISI by General Bajwa, which was not taken very kindly by Imran Khan at that particular time, but General Bajwa had his way, which is what the military always has in Pakistan anyway. So with that also in mind, I'm not sure whether the Pakistan army is in a position to be able to do what is expected, that is to take over the situation in case everything breaks down.
Ambassador, that brings me to the question of, how Imran Khan has been repeatedly alleging that there is a foreign conspiracy in overthrowing his government. And just 2 days back, in fact, he was very, very forthright in actually naming a top US official, saying it's because of him, it's the United States conspiracy which is behind overthrowing his government. How much substance do you see in that allegation by Imran Khan? Time and again, despite the army trying to downplay the allegation, Imran Khan has once again alleged that it is America which is behind all of the state of affairs in Pakistan at the moment. And also, do you see any relation to the fact that Imran Khan was present in Moscow, was meeting Vladimir Putin on the very day that Russia invaded Ukraine? Do you see a correlation and the allegation that now Imran Khan is making against America?
Well, it's quite clear that the Pakistani relationship with the United States has plummeted downwards, and that has been a longer process than just the past few weeks. His visit to Russia at that time also would have certainly not helped in improving relations. But what he is doing now, I think everyone will see as part of domestic politics. And I don't think it will have a catastrophic impact on relations with the United States, because those relations are already in pretty bad shape. And I don't see the United States using this as an instance to let them deteriorate further. I think this will be seen as part of domestic politics. Imran Khan's reputation has always been one of someone who doesn't play by the books. The last time he did something equally outrageous, or one of the times he did something equally outrageous, was when he resorted to a 4-month-long protest in Islamabad in 2014, which led to a postponement of a state visit by the president of China. Now, at that time, this was seen as something which was very bad. It was not done. But Imran Khan, because he had taken a particular position and he found that it helped him consolidate his core constituency, didn't really care about Pakistan's relations with China at that point of time. And whatever impact they had on the Pakistan-China relations was in fact temporary, because the Chinese also saw this as part of domestic politics. They were not very happy about it then, but they took it in their stride. And I think the United States will do the same this time around.
Professor, despite falling out with the army, differences with the army, Imran Khan has maintained a very, very confident, posture. At least what we've seen in the last 2 days, sort of cornered the opposition, taken them by surprise. Now, whatever the Supreme Court rules is another thing. We'll all have to wait and watch for more clarity on how things unfold in Pakistan. But what, according to you, are the factors which are giving Imran Khan the confidence? What is it that he sees as an advantage for himself, so much so that he even called for fresh elections?
Indeed, when it became almost absolutely clear to Imran Khan that he is not likely to stay in office, he thought the best opportunity for him was to call for general elections, which, of course, the fact that President Arif Alvi accepted immediately and announced that looks a bit interesting, because last 6 to 8 months, reports are saying that President and General Bajwa were actually in communication with the opposition parties. And the one insinuation is that, it is not just United States, but domestically also, the so-called deep state was perhaps engaged with opposition parties coming together the way they did. But now when opposition parties have kind of stood together and almost threatened the president to be impeached, he's now talking of selecting the caretaker prime minister in consultation with opposition parties. So in that sense, obviously the clout that an outgoing prime minister would have had perhaps is reduced, but the posturing that you mentioned, the confidence that Imran Khan is at least showcasing, is clearly aimed at his electioneering. It's already in that mode of thinking of next general elections and how he's going to be contesting those national elections again. And that is posturing fundamentally, whereas I think every politician in Pakistan clearly understands that a certain positive equation or synergy, I would say, with the armed forces is very critical. We also need to underline that in November, I think, again, we are going to see Bajwa's term is coming, General Bajwa's term is coming to an end. There was talk about General Hamid maybe, taking that position. So not just within armed forces, there could be certain contestations, but I think army and politicians' equations would also be dependent on, whether General Bajwa stays beyond November or he's being replaced by another general. So in that kind of uncertainty, I think this confidence the showcasing is a strategy for Imran Khan to look at next elections, because apparently he doesn't see, other than possibly Shehbaz Sharif, any other serious contender to him in general elections, provided his equations can come back to normal. We understand that General Bajwa's speech recently at Islamabad, the security dialogue, was at complete variance with what Imran Khan has been saying. He went all the way out to kind of placate United States by saying that half of Ukraine is destroyed, and he called out aggression of Russia, saying it can't be condoned, which again, actually, interestingly, was happening when Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister, was negotiating rollover of the kind of payments of debt to China, the 4.5 billion, which ultimately happened. So that kind of posting by General Bajwa, again, was to ensure that there's not too much damage of this constant campaign, that the shrill campaign that Prime Minister was doing of blaming United States, particularly Assistant Secretary for South Asia and Central Asia, Donald Lu, naming names. I mean, that is really insinuating too harshly. So I assume that at this stage, the question that you asked me of the confidence of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who we can almost see outgoing Prime Minister, is based on fundamentally two things. One, he's looking at showcasing that positive synergy with the military to the electorate. So he's complimenting the Pakistanis, saying, National Assembly has taken great decision in terms of Deputy Speaker Qasim Suri taking the decision of dismissing the no confidence motion resolution. At the same time, I think he is also aware of the fact that he apparently, among whatever great politicians now exist in Pakistan, he possibly could be a choice that perhaps becomes acceptable to army and awam in that sense, both. And since there is several examples of prime ministers having come back repeatedly, I think that imagination of him coming back again as Prime Minister is something that possibly is supporting his smile.
Absolutely. And I think more than Awam, Lieutenant General, it's important. Synergy with the army is very, very critical for the Prime Minister in Pakistan. Now, in just 3.5 years, we've seen how differences have cropped up between Imran Khan and the all-powerful army in Pakistan. How do you look at the future? What do you think is going to be the army's next move? All of these years, we've seen more than, since independence, more than half of the time, it's the army who's called the shots. Even now, of course, even though there's a prime minister, the army is calling the shots. For how long will these differences remain? For how long will the army maintain a neutral stand, at least try to maintain a neutral stand and not get in directly? Please unmute, sir.
I don't think there is anything called a neutral stance as far as the Pakistan army is concerned. The Pakistan army has, for the better part of the last 70 years, has always been in control. For the last couple of years, and go back almost 35 years or so, the Pakistan army has been indirectly in control. It's essentially the security policy, the foreign policy and security policy, which has been dictated by the deep state completely. To an extent, economic policy also. They have directed it to some extent. This whole thing is managed, this whole relationship is apparently managed by the deep state. And the Pakistan army is hardly likely to step back from that situation. It's a question of calibration as to how much would they like to go forward in taking control. And as I said in my earlier intervention, this is not the kind of situation where General Bajwa would like to take over, because it is only negative, nothing else. And the economy and the army does not have a magic wand to be able to immediately swing the whole situation around. So I think the army is going to calibrate a lot. They will want to see a civilian government definitely and continue to maintain a strong stance behind them, a strong stance of control behind them. General Bajwa has been a strong chief. He's going to be 6 years in power, which is, well, we've earlier had Pakistan army chiefs also being in power for 6 years, but he's definitely been a strong army chief. And I do not think that General Bajwa would be looking towards the end of his tenure in November, December.
Lieutenant General, since you're a defense expert, what is your assessment? What is your assessment, since you've been closely following the situation over the years in Pakistan? In case the Supreme Court decides to allow fresh elections, the snap elections that Imran Khan has pitched for, who do you think the army will be batting for this time? There's a fractured opposition, and on one side is Imran Khan.
I'm not sure that the opposition is really fractured at this moment. You're seeing some photographs, very interesting photographs of Shehbaz Sharif and the Bhutto family together, sitting together and discussing things. And the army seems to be backing that for the moment. There are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies as far as Pakistan politics are concerned. And obviously, the Pakistan army thinks that this is the most viable option at this juncture, at this particular moment. Come November, December, or come elections in August, September, whenever they take place, it could be a completely different situation. This has happened very often in Pakistan's history, where the Pakistan army has swung its support around to different parties. But one thing is quite certain, I don't think the selected Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, is going to receive the support of the Pakistan army this time, at least in this year, because I don't see circumstances really changing in that particular way. He has messed up. He has messed up royally as far as the economy is concerned, as far as the foreign policy is concerned, and the Pakistan army would definitely be wanting to retrieve the situation at this time, and probably thinks that Shehbaz Sharif, with the backing of a reasonably stable opposition at the moment, which becomes a government ultimately, is the best solution at the moment for Pakistan.
The optics show that they are a united front, but whether it is just to overthrow Imran Khan, whether they're able to, maintain this united stand is something that we'll have to watch out for in the next few days. But Ambassador, amidst all of this turmoil, we've once again seen an outreach for dialogue with India from the Pakistani army. How is India looking at all of that? Are we insisting on our, stand that when it comes to Pakistan, that terrorism and talks can't go together? How are we watching this situation unfold in our neighbor?
Well, what happens in the next few days clearly will have some bearing on India-Pakistan relations too, which, although overall relations have been pretty bad, but the last year or so has seen some positive developments. We have had a ceasefire which has held remarkably well. We saw the transit of wheat through Pakistan to Afghanistan. We have seen the reopening of the Nankana Sahib corridor. And there have been generally statements which have been foregrounding stability rather than going back to the normal rhetoric which emanates from Pakistan. I think a lot of this probably can be attributed to General Bajwa's influence, because he has repeatedly made statements about the importance of geoeconomics, about stability in relations with India, and looking for peaceful ways to resolve bilateral problems. But the fact is that while the Pakistan military is important and in many ways very important, it is not as if it is the only player in town. This has always been the problem which confronts our Pakistan policy, that how do you have a policy which is calibrated both towards the military and towards the political class, and what happens when those two, that is the political class and the military, are opposed to each other or are in the middle of their own battle. I think in those circumstances, having a stable policy becomes that much more difficult. And it is possible that we will have to wait and see what kind of situation emerges out of the current constitutional crisis and political crisis before we decide on next steps.
Absolutely. So for the moment, the best bet for India is to just wait and watch and look at how things emerge in our neighborhood. It will have implications on our relations, of course, as the ambassador was pointing out. But at the moment, Pakistan is reeling under political and constitutional crisis, and most importantly, economic crisis. And therefore, the question remains on whether the country is actually in a situation wherein it can afford to have a fresh round of elections. Inflation is at an all-time high. The economic health of the country is adequately very, very bad, as we've spoken about. So in such circumstances, what is the best thing for Pakistan to actually come out of this crisis is something that the Supreme Court will have to pronounce after the hearings are complete by tomorrow. So I think all eyes will be on what the Supreme Court actually has to say after hearing all representatives in this very, very high-profile case. So time is running out. With that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of Perspective. I would once again like to thank all my guests, Lieutenant General, Professor, and Ambassador, for joining us on the program and sharing your thoughts, your perspective with us and our viewers. It's always a pleasure to have you on our show. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective today. Thanks very much to all our viewers as well for their time.